I never thought I'd sleep with my own boss, but one day he said, "Close the door."
Would you give in to temptation too? Share your opinion in the comments.
If you had told me a year ago that I would be standing in my boss's office, my heart pounding in my chest for all the wrong reasons, I would have laughed in your face. Me? The loyal wife, the dedicated employee, the woman who never took risks. I had spent years carefully crafting my life into something stable, something predictable. And yet, here I was, teetering on the edge of something reckless, something dangerous. And it all started so simply. I had worked at Kensington and Reeves for nearly 7 years. It was the kind of job that was impressive on paper, the kind people nodded approvingly at when I told them what I did. But in reality, it was just a place I went every day to keep my life moving forward. My work was fine, my colleagues were fine, and my boss, Damian Kensington, was not fine. He was something else entirely. Tall, charismatic, intimidating in a way that made people straighten their backs when he entered a room. He was the kind of man who commanded attention without asking for it. People respected him, feared him, wanted to impress him, and I was no exception. At first, I admired him in the way any professional would admire a successful leader. He built the company from the ground up, and despite his reputation for being ruthless, there was no denying that he was brilliant. But over time, admiration turned into something else, something I refused to name. Something that made my stomach twist whenever he looked at me just a second too long. It started subtly, a glance here, a touch there, nothing inappropriate, nothing I could pinpoint as definitively wrong. But I knew, I could feel the shift, the undercurrent of something brewing beneath the surface. The first real moment happened on a Wednesday evening. I had stayed late, finishing up a report that was due the next morning. The office was nearly empty, the usual chatter and ringing phones replaced by silence. I had just printed the final pages when I heard footsteps behind me. "You work too much," Damian's voice came from the doorway. I turned, my breath catching slightly. "Says the man who's also still here." He smirked, stepping further into the room. "Fair point, but I own the company, what's your excuse?" I laughed softly, shaking my head, trying to stay ahead. He studied me for a moment, his eyes unreadable. "That's what I like about you, Olivia, you're always trying." The way he said my name, too familiar, too knowing, sent a shiver down my spine. He stepped closer, and suddenly the space between us felt too small, the air too thick. I could smell his cologne, something dark and expensive. My pulse quickened, a warning sign I chose to ignore. "You deserve to be noticed more," he said, his voice softer now. "People like you are the reason this company thrives." I swallowed hard. This is just a conversation, a compliment, that's all. But deep down, I knew better. After that night, everything changed. Damian was always professional in front of others, but when we were alone, something else lingered between us. A tension neither of us acknowledged, but both of us felt. He started finding reasons to talk to me more, reasons to pull me into late meetings, reasons to be closer. And I let him. Maybe it was the excitement, the thrill of knowing that someone like him was paying attention to me. Maybe it was the fact that, for the first time in years, I felt seen. But whatever it was, I didn't stop it. The first real mistake happened 3 weeks later. It was another late night. Damian had called me into his office to discuss a last-minute client proposal. It should have been nothing, just another meeting. But from the moment I walked in, I could tell it was. He was leaning against his desk, sleeves rolled up, his tie loosened. His usual composed demeanor had cracks in it tonight. He looked at me differently, like he was debating something, like he was about to cross a line. "Close the door," he said. My heart pounded. Why? Because I don't want to be interrupted. I hesitated for only a second before obeying. The moment the latch clicked, I knew I had sealed my fate. The conversation started normal enough. Work, the project, numbers and percentages I wasn't really listening to, but then the air shifted. "You're brilliant, you know that?" he said suddenly. I let out a breathy laugh. "I think you've said that before." "Have I?" he smirked, stepping closer. "Maybe I just like saying it." I should have backed away. I should have said something to break whatever spell was wrapping around us, but I didn't. I stayed right where I was, letting him close the distance between us until I could feel the heat of his body near mine. "Tell me to stop," he murmured. My breath hitched. "Damian." But he didn't give me time to finish. His lips were on mine before I could think, before I could convince myself that this was a mistake. And the worst part, I didn't want him to stop. I drove home that night with shaking hands. Mark was already asleep when I slipped into bed beside him, my skin still burning from the memory of Damian's touch. I stared at the ceiling, my mind spinning. I should have felt guilt. I should have felt shame. But all I felt was want. And I knew this was only the beginning. I told myself it was a one-time thing. That I had lost control for a moment, that the heat between us had been overwhelming, but it was over. I told myself that I would walk into the office the next morning and things would go back to the way they were before. But they didn't. Because the moment I stepped into work, the moment I saw Damian leaning against his desk, sleeves rolled up, looking at me like he knew exactly what had happened between us, I knew that the lie I was telling myself wouldn't hold. Something had changed, and I wasn't sure I wanted to change it back. "Olivia," he greeted, his voice lower than usual, his smirk just enough to send a jolt through me. I swallowed hard, nodded, and stepped past him toward my desk. I could feel his gaze on me the entire time. It was a dangerous game, and we both knew it. But neither of us wanted to stop playing. The weeks that followed were a blur of stolen moments and near misses. Every encounter was laced with tension. A brush of his hand against mine when he handed me a document. A quiet word murmured too close to my ear during a meeting. The way his fingers would skim the small of my back when he passed by. At night, I lay awake beside Mark, staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction, every almost touch, every heated glance. I should have felt guilty. But I didn't. I felt alive. Then came the night that changed everything. Damian had asked me to stay late again. Another meeting, another excuse, another opportunity. And I should have said no, I should have walked away. But I didn't. By the time the office emptied, it was just the two of us, a single lamp illuminating his desk. I stood in the doorway, hesitating, knowing exactly where this was headed but unable to turn around. "Come in, Olivia," he said smoothly, his eyes locked on mine. "Just for a minute." I stepped inside. The air was thick, charged with something electric. He didn't speak right away, didn't move. He just watched me waiting, knowing I would make the next move. And I did. Because deep down, I knew there was never any other choice, not anymore. When I finally got home that night, Mark was already asleep. I slipped into bed beside him, my heart still racing from what had happened just hours before. I had done it, I had truly crossed the line. And yet, as I lay there in the dark, the only thing I could think about was Damian. I thought it would be easier, that once I had crossed the line, I would settle into this new reality. That the guilt would fade, that I would be able to compartmentalize, to balance both worlds without feeling like I was constantly walking on the edge of a knife. I was wrong, because the moment you start living a double life, it owns you. Damian and I became a secret wrapped in stolen moments. Late-night meetings that were never about work. His hands brushing against mine in the hallway, his voice dropping to a murmur when we were alone. A text message that sent my pulse racing. "I need to see you. Now." Every time we were together, I told myself it would be the last. That I would stop before it got too deep, before I lost control completely. And yet, every time I went back to him. Mark noticed something was different. "You've been distracted lately," he said one night as we sat on the couch. "Everything okay?" I forced a smile, pretending to focus on the TV. "Yeah, just work stress. Damian's been pushing a lot of late nights." Mark frowned but nodded. He believed me, or at least he wanted to. With every passing week, the weight of my deception grew heavier. And yet, the thought of stopping, of walking away from Damian, felt impossible. Because when I was with him, I wasn't just Mark's wife. I was something else. Something I wasn't sure I was ready to let go of. The night everything changed, it wasn't planned. I had stayed late, another excuse, another lie. Damian was waiting in his office, leaning against his desk, watching me as I closed the door behind me. "You're playing with fire," he murmured, stepping closer. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding. "I know," he smirked, tracing a finger along my wrist. "Then why do you keep coming back?" I had no answer, because I didn't want to tell him the truth, that I wasn't sure who I was without him anymore. The deeper I fell into this affair, the more exhausting it became to pretend nothing had changed. Every morning, I woke up next to Mark, kissed him goodbye, and told myself I was still the same woman I had always been. And every night, I found myself back in Damian's office, tangled in sheets that were not my own, letting him consume me in ways I had never allowed myself before. I told myself I was still in control. But the truth was, I was losing everything. It started with the small things. Mark noticed the way I was always on my phone, how my responses were slower, more careful. He started asking about work more, his questions becoming a little too specific. "You've been spending a lot of time with Damian lately," he said one evening, his voice light but his eyes sharp. I forced a casual laugh. "He's my boss, Mark, that's kind of the job." He nodded, but I could see it, doubt. And once that seed was planted, it would only grow. Damian, on the other hand, was becoming bolder. "When are you going to stop pretending you still want to go home to him?" he murmured one night, his fingers trailing down my spine. I tensed. "Damian, don't." "Don't what?" He turned me to face him. "Tell the truth, we both know you don't love him anymore." My breath caught. Was that true? Had I really stopped loving Mark, or had I just convinced myself that I had? I should have ended it then, walked away before everything came crashing down. But instead, I let Damian pull me back into his bed, silencing the doubt with his touch. Because it was easier to keep falling than it was to stop. And deep down, I knew the fall was going to kill me. I had convinced myself that I could keep everything separate: my marriage, my affair, my carefully constructed life. But the truth was, I was playing a game I was never going to win. Because no matter how well you build a house of cards, it only takes one wrong move for everything to collapse. Mark's questions became more frequent. At first they were subtle. "Late night again?" he'd ask, his voice calm but his eyes searching. Then they became sharper. "Who were you texting just now? You looked nervous." I'd lie, of course, I always lied. "Just work stuff. Damian needs those reports finalized by morning." Mark never said he didn't believe me, but he stopped kissing me before bed. And then Damian made things worse. "Come away with me," he said one evening, his hands framing my face, his eyes dark with something I couldn't quite name. "Just for a weekend." I pulled back, my stomach twisting. "Damian, you know I can't do that." He exhaled, shaking his head. "You act like this is temporary, Olivia. Like you'll wake up one day and go back to your husband and pretend none of this ever happened. But you won't." I opened my mouth, but no words came out, because deep down, I was afraid he was right. The unraveling happened faster than I expected. Mark came home early one day. I had just stepped out of the shower when I heard the front door open. My phone was on the bed, Damian's name flashing on the screen with a message I hadn't even read yet. Mark walked into the bedroom, his eyes immediately flicking to my phone, to the name glowing against the dim light. Damian Kensington. Silence. A long, horrible silence. Then quietly, "Tell me the truth." My heart pounded so loudly I thought I might pass out. "Mark, Don't lie to me, Olivia. I deserve the truth." My throat tightened. "It's not what you think." He let out a bitter laugh. "Not what I think, so my wife's boss texts her at night and it's just business." "Mark, how long?" His voice cracked, his entire body rigid. "How long have you been lying to me?" I opened my mouth, closed it. There was no way out of this. "A few months," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He stared at me like he didn't recognize me anymore. "Jesus Christ, Olivia." That night, he didn't sleep in our bed. He barely looked at me. And I knew, without him even saying it, that I had finally broken something I could never fix. I went to work the next morning, feeling like a ghost. Damian was waiting in his office, his usual confidence in place, but when he saw my face, he frowned. "What happened?" I closed the door behind me. "Mark knows." His expression barely changed. And that was it. No fear, no regret, no hesitation, just acceptance. Something inside me cracked. "That's all you have to say." Damian sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I told you this would happen, Olivia. You should have left him before he found out." I let out a sharp laugh, more disbelief than humor. "That's your solution? I should have just left my husband for you?" He arched a brow. "Isn't that where this was headed anyway?" I froze, because the scariest part was I didn't know the answer. That night, I drove around aimlessly, unwilling to go home and face Mark, unable to call Damian for comfort. For the first time since this all began, I was completely alone, and I realized something I should have known from the start. This wasn't love. This was self-destruction. I didn't go home that night, I couldn't. Instead, I drove aimlessly, the city lights blurring past me, my mind replaying Mark's expression over and over again. The disbelief, the pain, the quiet, simmering anger beneath it all. I had destroyed something real for something that, now, felt so insignificant. Was it ever worth it? I parked in an empty lot, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My entire world had been upended in a single evening, and yet, the one person I had risked everything for, he didn't seem to care at all. Damian called twice, I didn't answer. I knew what he would say. This was inevitable. This is what happens when you try to live two lives. He had never once told me he loved me, not really. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized he never had to, because for him, this was never about love. I had been a challenge, a conquest, a fleeting thrill. And now I was nothing. When I finally went home the next morning, the house was eerily quiet. I expected anger, maybe even an argument, but Mark wasn't waiting for me in the living room. He was gone. A note sat on the kitchen counter, 3 words, "I deserve better." And just like that, I lost him. Days passed in a blur. I went to work, but everything felt hollow. My coworkers avoided me, whispering when they thought I couldn't hear. They knew, maybe they had always known. Damian, however, carried on as if nothing had happened. "You're better off," he said one evening as I sat in his office, staring at my reflection in the glass window. "You knew your marriage was over the moment you came to me." I looked at him then, really looked at him, the man who had unraveled my life with a smirk and a whisper, and for the first time I felt nothing. "No," I said quietly, "I think it was over the moment you kissed me." He tilted his head as if amused. "And do you regret it?" I wanted to say yes, I wanted to scream it, but the truth was, regret didn't change anything. So instead I stood up, smoothing down my skirt. "Goodbye, Damian." He raised a brow, "That simple." I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. "It has to be." And then I walked out, leaving him behind. I didn't go back home. Instead, I booked a hotel for a week, needing space, needing to breathe. I stared at my phone too often, wondering if Mark would call. He didn't. But I didn't blame him. I had spent so long convincing myself that I was searching for something more, passion, excitement, something beyond the routine of marriage. But in the end, all I had found was emptiness. And the worst part, I had no one to blame but myself. The worst part of losing everything isn't the loss itself. It's the silence that follows. The kind of silence that stretches across empty rooms where once there was laughter. The silence of a phone that doesn't ring. The silence of knowing that you are no longer needed, no longer wanted, no longer thought about. And I was drowning in it. A week had passed since Mark left, and I had yet to hear his voice. No angry texts, no calls, not even an email asking what to do with the house. It was like I had died in his world, like I had never existed at all. I thought about reaching out, about apologizing, about begging for another chance. But what would I say? Sorry I broke your heart? Sorry I chose the wrong man? Sorry I ruined our life for something that never meant anything at all? No words could fix what I had done. So I stayed silent too. I went back to work, but it wasn't the same. People whispered when I walked by. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. I had gone from being respected to being a cautionary tale. And Damian, he barely acknowledged me now. It was over and we both knew it. "How's life after your big decision?" he asked one evening, leaning against my desk, his tone teasing but his eyes cold. I looked up at him, feeling a dull, hollow ache in my chest. "You were never the decision, Damian. You were just the mistake." For the first time since I had met him, he had nothing to say. That night, I finally called Mark. It went straight to voicemail. Of course it did. I took a shaky breath and spoke anyway. "I know I don't deserve to ask for anything, but if you ever want to talk, even if it's just to tell me you never want to hear from me again, I'll listen." I hung up before my voice could break. And then I cried for the man I had lost, for the woman I used to be, for the life I had thrown away. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if Mark will ever forgive me, if I will ever forgive myself. But I do know one thing. This time, the silence is mine to live with.
Thank you for watching the video. If you want to hear more stories, subscribe to the channel and like the video. Videos are released every day. Good luck to everyone.